She sat across from her billionaire husband in that glass tower office, divorce papers in front of her, worth exactly $250,000 after 8 years of marriage. He was scrolling through his phone, bored, already thinking about the 24-year-old he'd left her for. His lawyer smirked. Another trophy wife, broken and desperate, about to sign away what little dignity she had left. And then Catherine smiled. Not a sad smile, not a bitter smile, a smile that made her husband's blood run cold. Because what Marcus Thorne didn't know, what his team of expensive lawyers didn't know, was that Catherine had spent 18 months building a case that would destroy him. She had screenshots of every crime, recordings of every lie, and a plan so perfect that he was about to willingly hand her the one thing that would send him to prison for 15 years. He thought he was divorcing a broken woman. He was actually signing his own arrest warrant. This is the true story of how a woman with a PhD, $800 in her bank account, and nothing left to lose took down a $400 million empire. How she turned her husband's arrogance into his downfall. How she smiled, signed those papers, and drove off with the evidence that would change everything. Because revenge isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a smile in a conference room. Sometimes it's a pen on paper. Sometimes it's knowing exactly what's coming next while everyone else thinks you have already lost. This is her story, and trust me, you need to hear every single word. Let's begin. The conference room smelled like expensive leather and broken promises. Catherine sat perfectly still in the Herman Miller chair, her hands folded on the polished mahogany table, watching her husband of 8 years check his phone for the 14th time in 20 minutes. Marcus Thorne didn't look up when his lawyer slid the divorce papers across the table. He was already somewhere else, probably texting the woman he'd left Catherine for. Or maybe it was a different woman entirely. At this point, Catherine had lost count. "Mrs. Thorne," the lawyer said, his voice carrying that particular brand of Boston Brahmin courtesy that barely masked contempt. "We believe you will find these terms more than generous, given the prenuptial agreement you signed." Catherine looked down at the papers. $250,000, the Beacon Hill townhouse, which sounded impressive until you realized it was mortgaged for more than it was worth, and a confidentiality agreement that would legally prevent her from ever speaking about Marcus or their marriage to anyone ever. 8 years of her life summarized in 12 pages of legal text. She picked up the Mont Blanc pen Marcus's lawyer offered. It was heavy, expensive, the kind of pen that cost more than her first car. Her hand was steady as she brought it to the signature line. And then she smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small curve at the corner of her lips, barely noticeable. But Marcus saw it. For the first time since they had entered the room, he looked directly at her, and something flickered across his face. Confusion, maybe, or the first whisper of fear. "Sign it, Catherine," he said. His voice had that edge to it, the one that used to make her flinch. "I have a lunch meeting at 1. Catherine signed her name in smooth, even strokes. Catherine Marie Brown, not Thorne. She'd already started using her maiden name again, at least in her head. "There," she said softly, sliding the papers back across the table. "All done." Marcus exhaled, visibly relieved. His lawyer gathered the documents with practiced efficiency, already moving on to whatever billable hours awaited him after lunch. Marcus stood buttoning his Tom Ford suit jacket, and that's when Catherine spoke again. "I want one more thing." The room went still. Marcus's lawyer froze, his hand hovering over his leather briefcase. Marcus turned slowly, his jaw tight. "We had an agreement, Bob," he said. "I know, and I'm not changing anything. I just want one item, for sentimental reasons." Catherine reached into her canvas tote bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She'd printed it at the FedEx office on Boylston Street that morning, paying $3.47. "I want this." She slid the paper across the table. Marcus's lawyer picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read. "This is an asset transfer document for an LLC, Trident Holdings." He looked at Marcus. "Is this one of your business entities?" Marcus had gone very pale. "What are you doing?" he asked Catherine, his voice low and dangerous. "The LLC owns a car," Catherine said pleasantly, "a Porsche 918 Spider. The custom one, midnight blue with the gold calipers. You call it the Trident. I want it." The lawyer looked confused. Mrs. Thorne, we can certainly arrange for you to receive a vehicle as part of the settlement. There's no need to transfer an entire corporate entity. That's a tax nightmare. We can just give you the car. No, Catherine said, still smiling. I want the LLC, all of it. The car, the accounts, everything registered to Trident Holdings. Sign it over to me, Marcus, and we're done. You'll never have to see me again. Marcus was staring at her now with an expression she'd never seen before. It took her a moment to recognize it because she'd never inspired it in him during their entire marriage. He was afraid. How do you know about Trident? He whispered. Catherine tilted her head as if considering the question. I was your wife for 8 years, Marcus. Did you really think I was as stupid as you always told me I was? The lawyer cleared his throat. Mr. Thorne, if there's an issue with this entity, I need to know. You provided us with a full financial disclosure. If there are hidden assets that weren't included, that could invalidate the entire prenuptial agreement and open you up to, well, significant legal exposure. Marcus and Catherine locked eyes across the table. She could see him calculating, trying to figure out how much she knew, what she had, what she could do. His mind was racing. She could almost hear the gears turning. Finally, he reached for the pen. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. Take the stupid car. I hope you wrap it around a telephone pole. He signed the transfer document with a violent slash of the pen. Catherine took it calmly, folded it in half, and tucked it into her tote bag next to her wallet and her dead iPhone and the protein bar she'd eaten for breakfast because she'd been too nervous to make real food. Thank you, she said, standing. It's been a pleasure, gentlemen. She walked out of the conference room, down the hallway with its original crown molding and oil paintings of dead attorneys, and out onto Tremont Street. The October air hit her face, cold and sharp and real. She'd been in that building for 47 minutes. She'd been in that marriage for 8 years. And now it was over. She walked 3 blocks to the parking garage where she'd left Jenny's Toyota Camry. Her best friend had lent it to her that morning with a hug and a thermos of coffee and strict instructions to call the moment she was done. Catherine sat in the driver's seat and pulled out her phone. But she didn't call Jenny. Not yet. Instead, she opened her encrypted email app, the one she'd set up 6 months ago on a library computer, and sent a single message to an address she'd memorized and then deleted from every device she owned. The message had no subject line and only 2 words in the body. It's done. She hit send and watched the message disappear into the digital ether. Then she started Jenny's car and drove towards South Boston, toward a storage unit she'd rented under a fake name, where a very expensive midnight blue Porsche was waiting for her. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why Catherine smiled when she signed those divorce papers, to understand how a woman with $847 in her checking account managed to outmaneuver a tech billionaire worth $400 million, you need to know the whole story. You need to know how she got here. And it starts 8 years earlier, on a Tuesday night in October, at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, at a private donor event where Catherine wore a dress from Target and served champagne to people who spent more on shoes than she made in a month. It starts with a man in an expensive suit who asked her opinion on a painting and then proceeded to tell her why she was wrong. It starts the way these stories always start, with a woman who didn't know she was walking into a trap. Catherine had been working at the Museum of Fine Arts for 3 years when she met Marcus Thorne. She was 24, fresh out of Boston University, with a PhD in art history and a mountain of student debt that haunted her dreams. $127,000. That number lived in her head like a second heartbeat. The museum job paid $38,000 a year. After taxes, after her tiny studio apartment in Alston, after the minimum payments on her loans, she had about $600 a month to live on. She ate a lot of ramen. She wore the same 3 outfits in rotation. She told herself she was paying her dues, that this was temporary, that eventually her career would take off. She loved art. She loved the museum. She loved standing in the European galleries on quiet Tuesday mornings when the light came through the windows just right and hit the Renoir. And for a moment she could pretend she was in Paris, that she was someone else, someone whose life wasn't measured in interest rates and clearance rack fines. The donor event was part of her job description. Junior curators were expected to schmooze with wealthy patrons, to be charming and knowledgeable and grateful. Catherine wore her one good dress, black and simple, from the Target clearance rack. 3 years old and starting to pill, but it would do. She was standing near a Mark Rothko painting, a massive canvas of orange and red that seemed to vibrate with internal light when he approached her. "What do you see?" he asked. Catherine turned. The man was tall, maybe 6'2", with dark hair going gray at the temples and eyes so blue they looked almost artificial. His suit was beautiful. She didn't know enough about men's fashion to identify the designer, but she knew expensive when she saw it. Everything about him screamed money, from his Italian shoes to the watch on his wrist that probably cost more than her car. "I'm sorry," she said. "The Rothko. What do you see when you look at it?" He smiled, and it transformed his face from handsome to devastating. "I'm genuinely curious. You've been standing here for 10 minutes. Catherine felt herself blush. "I work here. I'm allowed to look at the art." "I know you work here. You're Catherine Brown. You wrote that brilliant piece on Caravaggio's use of darkness for the Museum Journal." "I'm Marcus Thorne." He extended his hand. Catherine shook it, surprised by the firmness of his grip, the warmth of his palm. "You read the Museum Journal?" she asked, incredulous. "I read everything, especially when it's written by beautiful women with PhDs. His smile widened. "So tell me, what do you see in the Rothko?" Catherine turned back to the painting. This was her element. This was where she felt confident. "I see rage," she said softly. "Everyone always talks about Rothko's work being about transcendence and spirituality, and that's there, but this piece specifically, I think it's about anger. Look at how the orange blocks seem to push against the red. There's violence in it, controlled violence, but violence nonetheless." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Interesting, but you're wrong." Catherine blinked. "Excuse me?" "The orange doesn't push against the red. It reaches for it. This isn't about rage, it's about longing. The separation between the two colors, that negative space, that's what the painting is really about. The ache of things that can never quite touch." He looked at her, his blue eyes intense. Rothko was depressed when he painted this. He was thinking about endings. "This isn't rage, it's grief." Catherine felt her cheeks burn. "I have a PhD in art history, and I have $40 million. Neither of those things means we're always right." But he said it with a smile, like it was a joke they were sharing. "Come on, let me buy you a drink, and we can argue about it properly." She should have said no. Looking back, Catherine would spend hours analyzing this moment, this decision. She should have recognized the red flags, the immediate dismissal of her expertise, the assumption that his interpretation was more valid than hers, the casual wielding of his wealth as a form of authority. But she was 24 and lonely and drowning in debt, and he was looking at her like she was the most fascinating person in the room. So she said yes. They had drinks at the museum bar, then dinner at a restaurant in the North End where the waiters knew him by name and brought them wine she couldn't pronounce and didn't offer her a menu because Marcus ordered for both of them. He told her about his company, Vortex Solutions, a tech startup he'd founded in his MIT dorm room that had exploded into a major player in data analytics. He told her about growing up in Connecticut, old money that he'd turned into new money, ventures and acquisitions and valuations that made Catherine's head spin. And he asked about her, really asked, about her research, her dissertation on Renaissance forgeries, her theories about authenticity and value. He listened like every word mattered. "You're wasted at that museum," he said as they shared tiramisu. "You should be teaching or consulting. Do you know how much art advisory firms charge? Thousands of dollars an hour." "I like the museum," Catherine said. But even as she said it, she thought about her studio apartment and her ramen dinners and the way her bank account made her stomach hurt every time she checked it. "You're brilliant," Marcus said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You deserve better than $38,000 a year. How do you know what I make?" "I'm very good at research." His thumb stroked across her knuckles. "Have dinner with me tomorrow night." She did, and the night after that, and the night after that. Marcus courted her like she was something precious. Flowers delivered to the museum, tickets to the symphony, a weekend trip to Martha's Vineyard, where they stayed in a house that overlooked the ocean and had more bathrooms than her entire apartment buildings. He paid off $30,000 of her student loans like it was nothing, like it was a gift you'd give someone for their birthday. "I don't need you stressed about money," he said when she tried to protest. "I want you to be happy." 3 months after they met, he asked her to move in with him. His townhouse in Beacon Hill had 4 floors and a private garden and windows that overlooked the common. Catherine's studio apartment had a radiator that clanked all night and a neighbor who practiced the drums at 6 a.m. She moved in on a Saturday. Jenny helped her pack her things, all of which fit into the back of Jenny's Camry. "Are you sure about this?" Jenny asked as they drove toward Beacon Hill. "It's really fast, Kath." "He loves me," Catherine said. "He barely knows you. He knows me better than anyone." And it felt true in that moment. Marcus asked her about her childhood, her dreams, her fears. He wanted to know everything. What Catherine didn't realize was that knowledge is power, and Marcus Thorne was very good at collecting power. 6 months after she moved in, he suggested she quit her job at the museum. Why? Catherine asked. They were having breakfast in his absurdly large kitchen, all marble and stainless steel. "Because you're miserable there. You come home exhausted every night, and I need someone to manage my art collection. I'll pay you $60,000 a year as my private curator. You can work from home. It'll be perfect." 60,000 was more than she'd ever made, and the museum had been cutting hours, talking about layoffs. Her position wasn't secure anyway. "Okay," she said. She quit the next week. She told herself it was a smart career move. She told herself a lot of things that year. Marcus proposed on their 1-year anniversary. They were at Top of the Hub, the restaurant on the 52nd floor of the Prudential Tower, and the entire city spread out below them like a promise. The ring was a 4-carat diamond from Tiffany that Catherine was afraid to wear in public. "Marry me," Marcus said, and it wasn't really a question. "Yes," Catherine said, and she meant it. The wedding was small, just immediate family, at his townhouse. Catherine's parents came up from Florida, her dad in a suit he'd bought at JCPenney, and her mom in a dress she'd made herself. They looked uncomfortable, out of place among Marcus's friends with their investment portfolios and vacation homes in Nantucket. Her little sister Maya was her maid of honor. Maya was 20 at the time, studying psychology at Florida State, bright and bubbly, and excited for Catherine's fairy tale romance. "You're so lucky," Maya whispered as she adjusted Catherine's veil. "He's like a prince." The prenup was presented to Catherine 48 hours before the wedding. 47 pages of dense legal language delivered by Marcus's attorney, a man named Gerald, who worked for one of those law firms with 6 last names. "It's standard," Marcus assured her when she looked overwhelmed. "Everyone at my level does this. It's just protecting assets I had before we met. It doesn't mean I don't love you." "It's very one-sided," Jenny said. Jenny was a paralegal, and Catherine had asked her to look it over. "Kath, if you divorce before 10 years, you get nothing, and I mean nothing. There's even a clause that if you cause him reputational damage or emotional distress, you forfeit any settlement." "That's insane." "He's not going to divorce me," Catherine said. "We're in love." "But if he does, he won't." Catherine signed the prenup. She signed it because she loved him, because she believed him when he said it was just a formality, because she was 25 years old and thought love was enough. She signed it because she didn't know any better. The first year of marriage was good. Marcus was attentive, generous. He took her to Paris, to Tokyo, to wine country in California. He introduced her as my brilliant wife at dinner parties. He bought her a new wardrobe, hired a personal shopper because her Target dresses wouldn't do anymore. Catherine went along with it, told herself she was adapting to her new life. But small things started to change. Marcus didn't like Jenny. "She's negative," he said, "always complaining about her life, her boyfriend. It's exhausting." So Catherine saw Jenny less. Her parents visited for Thanksgiving that first year, and Marcus made subtle comments about her dad's table manners, her mom's accent. "I'm not saying anything bad," he'd say, "just an observation." So Catherine stopped inviting them. He didn't like her working on her own research. "You're my curator," he'd say. "Focus on my collection." So Catherine stopped writing, stopped publishing, stopped engaging with the academic world she'd loved. She told herself it was fine. She told herself this was marriage, compromise, growing up. She told herself she was happy. And then, 2 years in, she found the hotel receipt in his jacket pocket. Boston Harbor Hotel, presidential suite, the same night he told her he was at a tech conference in Austin. When she confronted him, he didn't even try to lie. "Catherine, I have needs," he said, like he was explaining something obvious to a child. "You've gained weight. You're tired all the time. I'm not made of stone." She'd gained 15 pounds, stress eating, depression eating, the kind of weight that comes when you don't realize you're unhappy. "Are you serious right now?" Catherine's voice shook. "I'm being honest. Isn't that what you wanted? Honesty?" He sighed like she was being unreasonable, saying, "Look, if it bothers you this much, I'll be more discreet." That was the first time Catherine tried to leave. She packed a bag, called Jenny, showed up at her apartment at 2 in the morning, crying so hard she could barely breathe. "Leave him," Jenny said, holding her arm. "You don't need him. You can stay here. We'll figure it out." But the next morning, Catherine checked her bank account. Marcus had always handled their finances. She'd been his private curator for 2 years, but she realized with dawning horror that he'd never actually paid her. The $60,000 salary he'd promised existed on paper, but the money went into a joint account she couldn't access without his signature. Her personal checking account had $847 in it. She called the lawyer who'd handled the prenup. "What are my options?" she asked. The lawyer, a woman named Patricia, who sounded sympathetic, pulled up the documents. "Mrs. Thorne, you signed an extremely binding agreement. If you divorce before 10 years of marriage, you receive no assets, no alimony, nothing. And there's a morality clause. If you can be proven to have caused emotional distress or reputational harm to your husband, you forfeit even the right to contest the agreement." "But he cheated on me." "The prenup has no infidelity clause working in your favor. I'm sorry. Whoever drafted this did their job very well. For your husband, not for you." Catherine went back to the townhouse. Marcus was waiting with flowers, tears in his eyes, promises of couples therapy and change and devotion. "I'm sorry," he said, and he sounded like he meant it. "I was wrong. I love you. Please don't leave me." She stayed, not because she believed him, but because she didn't have a choice. $847 and nowhere to go. That was year 2. By year 6, Catherine had stopped counting the other women. There were so many. She found evidence everywhere. Lipstick on collars, texts he didn't bother to hide, credit card statements showing jewelry purchases she never received. He wasn't even discreet anymore. She learned to be numb. She learned to smile at his dinner parties, to play the role of devoted wife, to pretend everything was fine. She was good at it. So good that sometimes she almost believed it herself. And then Maya moved to Boston. Maya arrived on a Tuesday in September. Her entire life packed into 2 suitcases and a backpack. She was 24 now, fresh out of grad school with a master's in counseling psychology and a job offer at a nonprofit in Cambridge. Catherine picked her up from South Station, and when Maya threw her arms around her in a hug that smelled like vanilla body spray and youth and hope, Catherine almost started crying right there on the platform. "I can't believe I'm finally here," Maya said, bouncing on her toes. "Boston, with my big sister. This is going to be amazing." Catherine hadn't realized how lonely she'd been until Maya was standing in front of her, real and solid and familiar. She'd spent 6 years in Marcus's world, surrounded by his friends, his colleagues, his carefully curated social circle. No one was really hers. Even Jenny had drifted away, tired of watching Catherine defend the indefensible. "You're staying with us until you find an apartment, right?" Catherine said as they loaded the suitcases into the car. Marcus's car, a BMW he'd bought last year that Catherine was allowed to drive when he didn't need it. "If you're sure it's okay, I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing. Marcus is excited to meet you." This was a lie. Marcus had been annoyed when Catherine told him about Maya's visit, but he'd agreed to it, the way you'd agree to let someone bring a pet to stay, as long as it didn't make too much noise. Maya moved into the guest room on the 3rd floor. She was working long hours at the nonprofit, coming home exhausted but happy, full of stories about her clients and her coworkers. Catherine started cooking dinner again, something she hadn't done in years. They'd eat together in the kitchen, Just the two of them when Marcus worked late, which was most nights. They talk about their childhood in Florida, their parents, Maya's new relationship with a guy named Tom, who was doing his residency at Mass General. "You seem better," Maya said one night, 3 weeks after she'd arrived. "Happier." "I am," Catherine said. And it was true. Maya's presence had reminded her that she used to be a person, not just Marcus's wife. Marcus started coming home earlier. He joined them for dinner, charming and attentive, asking Mai Bai about her day, her work, her life. He was good at this, Catherine knew. The performance of caring. Maya didn't know any better. She thought he was wonderful. "You're so lucky, Sab," Maya said to Catherine one night when they were alone. "Marcus is amazing. He's so supportive of you." Catherine smiled and said nothing. What could she say? That he cheated on her more times than she could count? That he monitored her bank account? That she'd tried to leave 3 times and he'd always found a way to pull her back? Maya wouldn't believe her. The Marcus that Maya saw, the charming dinner companion who asked thoughtful questions and told funny stories, that Marcus was real too. That was the worst part. The mask wasn't entirely a mask. It was just the only part he chose to show. In October, Maya started staying out late. "Work drinks," she'd text. "Don't wait up." Catherine didn't think much of it. Maya was young and social and building a life in a new city. This was normal. Then one night, Marcus didn't come home. Catherine called his cell. It went straight to voicemail. She tried his office. No answer. At midnight, she started to worry. At 1 a.m., she started to panic. At 2 a.m., she called hospitals. At 2:30 in the morning, her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Crashed at the office. Fell asleep at my desk. Sorry. Home in the morning." Catherine exhaled. Okay, fine. He'd done it before. She went to bed, or tried to. She lay awake until 4 a.m. when she finally drifted into uneasy sleep. She woke at 7 to an empty bed. Marcus still wasn't home. Maya wasn't in her room either. Her bed was made, untouched. Catherine went downstairs, made coffee with shaking hands, told herself there was a reasonable explanation. Maya had slept at a friend's house. Marcus was stuck in traffic. Everything was fine. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her coffee going cold, when she heard a key in the front door. Marcus walked in, his suit rumpled, his hair disheveled, and behind him, adjusting her shirt and avoiding Catherine's eyes, was Maya. The world stopped. Catherine stood up slowly. "What is this?" Maya started crying immediately. "Kath, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. We were talking and you were talking." Catherine's voice didn't sound like her own. It sounded distant, mechanical. "You were talking." Marcus had the decency to look uncomfortable, but not guilty. Never guilty. "Catherine, I think we need to have a conversation about the state of our marriage." "The state of our marriage," Catherine laughed, and it came out broken. "You slept with my sister, and you want to talk about the state of our marriage." "You've been so cold for years," Marcus said, and he actually sounded aggrieved. "I have needs. Maya understands me in a way you haven't in a long time." Maya was still crying. "I love him, Kath. I know it's wrong. I know, but I love him, and he loves me, and we didn't want to hurt you, but we can't help how we feel." Catherine looked at her baby sister, who she'd changed diapers for, who she'd taught to read, who she'd helped with college applications and heartbreaks and growing pains. Maya, who'd been living in her home for 2 months, eating meals Catherine cooked, sleeping in a bed Catherine had made up with fresh sheets from Target because Marcus didn't want to waste his expensive linens on a guest. "Get out," Catherine said. "Kath, please, get out of my house." Maya ran upstairs sobbing. Marcus stood there, watching Catherine with something like curiosity, like she was an experiment that had produced unexpected results. "I want a divorce," Catherine said. "Fine," Marcus said. "I'll have my lawyer draw up the papers." He walked past her, went upstairs. Catherine heard the shower running. Maya came down 20 minutes later with her suitcases, mascara streaked down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Catherine said nothing. She watched her sister walk out the door, and then she went upstairs to the bathroom, locked the door, opened the medicine cabinet, and stared at the bottle of Ambien. She took out her phone with shaking hands and called the one person who'd always answered, even when Catherine didn't deserve it. Jenny? Her voice cracked. I need help. Jenny arrived in 15 minutes. She must have broken every traffic law in Boston. She found Catherine on the bathroom floor, the bottle of Ambien open on the counter, pills scattered in the sink. Did you take any? Jenny's voice was sharp with fear. No, I wanted to. I almost did. But I called you instead. Jenny pulled her to her feet. We're going to the hospital. No, I'm fine. You are not fine. You are the furthest thing from fine. We're going right now. The psychiatric emergency room at Mass General was fluorescent bright and smelled like industrial cleaner in desperation. Catherine was evaluated by a tired resident who asked her if she had a plan to hurt herself. No, Catherine said, and it was true. She'd wanted to disappear, wanted the pain to stop, but she didn't actually have a plan. She was too exhausted for a plan. They kept her for 72 hours of observation, 3 days in a locked ward with group therapy and medication evaluations, and nurses checking on her every 15 minutes. It should have been horrible. Instead, it was the first peace she'd had in years. On the second day, she met Diane. Diane was 58, a paralegal from Somerville, with gray hair and a neat bun and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked like somebody's mom. She looked safe. They were in the common room, Catherine staring at a jigsaw puzzle someone had started and abandoned, when Diane sat down across from her. First time? Diane asked. Is it that obvious? You've still got that shocked look, like you can't believe you ended up here. It fades. Diane picked up a puzzle piece, examined it, set it down. What's your story? Catherine told her. Not everything, but enough. The marriage, the cheating, the sister, the money, the prenup that meant she couldn't leave. The prenup can be broken, Diane said, if you can prove fraud or coercion or hidden assets. Are you a lawyer? Paralegal, 26 years. Diane smiled. I was married to a man like yours once, not as rich, but same kind of bastard. Controlled everything, made me believe I was nothing without him. I stayed for 18 years. What changed? I found his second bank account and his second family. Diane's smile turned sharp. Turns out he'd been living a whole other life in New Hampshire. Had a girlfriend, 2 kids he'd never told me about. I took everything, the house, the retirement account, every penny he'd hidden. He tried to fight it, but once I had evidence of the fraud, the prenup we'd signed was worthless. Catherine leaned forward. How did you find the account? I was smarter than he thought I was. Rich men always make that mistake. They think being rich makes them smart. But money isn't intelligence. It's just money. Diane locked eyes with her. If you want to leave, really leave, you need leverage. Find where he's hiding money. Find what he doesn't want found. And then use it. 3 days later, Catherine was released. Marcus hadn't visited once. He'd sent his lawyer instead, Gerald with his 6-name law firm, who presented Catherine with divorce papers in that insulting settlement offer. $250,000 in the townhouse. Sign these, Gerald said. Mr. Thorne wants to move on with his life. I'm sure you do too. Catherine took the papers. I need time to review them with my own attorney. Gerald looked annoyed. Mrs. Thorne, you signed a prenuptial agreement. There's nothing to review. This is a generous offer given the circumstances. I'll take my chances. I have 60 days to respond, right? That's what Massachusetts law says? Gerald's jaw tightened. Yes. And then I'll see you in 60 days. She showed him to the door. When he was gone, she went upstairs to Marcus's study, the one she was forbidden to enter, and sat down at his desk. On the drive home from the hospital, Jenny had given her something, a small USB device about the size of a postage stamp. It's a keylogger, Jenny had explained. You plug it into his computer, it records every keystroke, every password, every login, every email, completely undetectable. That's illegal, Catherine said. So is financial abuse, Jenny replied. Your choice, Kath, but if you want to fight back, you need ammunition. Catherine looked at the USB device now, sitting on Marcus's expensive mahogany desk. She thought about 8 years of her life, and she thought about her sister's betrayal. She thought about the prenup that was designed to leave her with nothing. She thought about Diane's words. Rich men always make that mistake. They think being rich makes them smart. Catherine plugged in the keylogger, and the real game began. For the first month, Catherine was the perfect wife, or rather, the perfect soon-to-be ex-wife. She was quiet, compliant, seemed broken. Marcus barely looked at her. He'd moved into the guest suite on the second floor, and most nights he wasn't home at all. Catherine assumed he was with Maya. She'd blocked her sister's number after the 15th tearful voicemail. She didn't have the energy for Maya's guilt or her justifications. Catherine spent her days in the townhouse alone, Shimon. She cleaned rooms that didn't need cleaning. She organized closets. She played the part of a woman in shock, going through the motions. But at night, when Marcus was gone, she sat at his computer and studied everything the keylogger had captured. The device was elegant in its simplicity. Every time Marcus typed anything, the keylogger recorded it and sent it to an encrypted cloud storage that Jenny had set up. Catherine reviewed the logs every evening, her laptop balanced on her knees, a glass of wine she didn't drink sitting forgotten on the side table. The first week was mostly boring. Work emails about data analytics and client meetings, texts to Maya that made Catherine's stomach turn. A lot of online shopping for things he didn't need. But in week 2, she found something interesting. Marcus had logged into a banking portal at 2 in the morning. Not their joint account at Bank of America, this was something else. A private wealth management firm called Castellan Trust. Catherine had never heard of them. She watched the keylogger data, saw Marcus navigate through account screens, and there, in the transaction history, she saw transfers. Lots of them, hundreds of thousands of dollars moving from Vortex Solutions accounts into Castellan Trust, then disappearing into a maze of secondary accounts. Catherine took screenshots of everything. Then she started researching. Castellan Trust was based in the Cayman Islands. That was red flag number 1. The company specialized in private wealth preservation and asset protection for high net worth individuals. Translation, they helped rich people hide money. Catherine spent 3 days building a spreadsheet, tracking every transaction she could find in the keylogger data. The pattern became clear. Marcus was systematically moving money out of Vortex and into offshore accounts. Not just his legitimate income. He was inflating expenses, creating fake consulting contracts, billing the company for services that didn't exist, and pocketing the difference. He was embezzling from his own company. Catherine sat back, her heart racing. This was fraud. This was illegal. If Vortex investors found out, if the SEC found out, Marcus would be destroyed. But she needed more. She needed to find where the money ultimately ended up. She kept digging. 2 weeks later, she found the reference to Trident Holdings. It was in an email Marcus had sent to someone named Sergei Volkov. The email was brief and cryptic. Trident payment processed. Agreed terms. V, happy with the spider. Catherine Googled Sergei Volkov. He was a Russian businessman, which was a polite way of saying oligarch. He had interests in oil, real estate, and import-export, which probably meant things you couldn't legally import or export. He was also, according to several articles Catherine found, a car collector. He owned one of the largest collections of rare sports cars in the world. The Spider, that had to be a car. Catherine went back through the keylogger data, searching for any mention of Trident. She found a login to a corporate registry website, watched Marcus navigate to a filing for Trident Holdings LLC, registered in the Cayman Islands. Single-purpose entity to hold and maintain luxury collector vehicles. She found the insurance documents. A Porsche 918 Spider, custom midnight blue with gold brake calipers, insured for $3.8 million. $3.8 million for a car, but it didn't make sense. Why would Marcus need an entire LLC just to own a car? Rich people bought expensive cars all the time. They didn't create offshore corporations to do it, unless the car wasn't the point. Catherine dug deeper. She found the loan documents. Trident Holdings had taken out a $50 million loan from Volkov Capital, Sergei's private investment firm. The collateral was listed as luxury asset vintage automotive, $50 million using the car as collateral, and the money from that loan had been distributed to a dozen other accounts, all of them offshore, all of them untraceable. Except Catherine was tracing them. Slowly, painstakingly, following the digital breadcrumbs, the money was being laundered. Marcus was taking his embezzled funds, running them through Trident Holdings, using the car as cover, and washing everything clean through a web of international transfers. Catherine sat in Marcus's study at 3 in the morning, her eyes burning, her coffee long cold, staring at the spreadsheet she'd built. It was beautiful in a way, elegant, the kind of scheme that required intelligence and planning and connections. Marcus thought he was so smart. He thought he had created the perfect system. He'd forgotten that Catherine had a PhD in research. He'd forgotten that before she'd met him, she'd spent years tracking stolen artwork through international black markets, following money trails across borders, identifying fakes and frauds and forgeries. He'd told her so many times that her work was cute, that it didn't matter, that it was a hobby for rich wives. He'd forgotten that she was very, very good at it. By month 3 of her investigation, Catherine had mapped the entire scheme. She had screenshots, transaction logs, email evidence, everything. She compiled it all into encrypted files stored in a cloud account Marcus didn't know existed, accessed from a laptop she'd bought at Best Buy with cash, using a name that wasn't hers. She had enough to bury him, to send him to prison, to destroy everything he'd built. But there was a problem. If she went to the authorities now, if she turned over this evidence, Marcus would fight back. He had lawyers, connections, money. He'd claim she'd fabricated the evidence, that she was a scorned wife seeking revenge. And even if he was eventually convicted, even if justice prevailed, the prenup would still stand. She'd still get nothing. Catherine needed to be smarter than that. She needed to make Marcus give her the leverage willingly. She needed him to hand over Trident Holdings himself, to sign away the one thing that connected him to all his crimes. She needed a plan. That's when she reached out to Lisa Brennan. Catherine found Lisa through a combination of obsessive Googling and old newspaper archives. Lisa Brennan, now Lisa Chen, had been Marcus's first wife. They'd been married for 3 years, divorced 10 years ago, right before Marcus started Vortec. The divorce records were sealed, but Catherine found a few mentions in society pages, a couple of photos from charity events. Catherine sent Lisa a message through LinkedIn, vague enough to be ignored if Lisa wasn't interested. "I'm going through a divorce and your name came up in my research. Would you be willing to talk?" Lisa responded within an hour. "Yes. Coffee?" They met at a Starbucks in Brookline, neutral territory. Lisa was 42, elegant in the way that came from good bone structure and better skin care. She wore a simple black dress and pearl earrings and looked like the kind of woman who'd learned to armor herself in professional polish. "You're wife number 2, Lisa said, stirring sugar into her coffee. It wasn't a question. "Soon-to-be ex-wife," Catherine said. "He cheated on you?" "Among other things," Lisa nodded. "He cheated on me too, multiple times, with my co-workers, my friends. He got my assistant pregnant. That's when I left." Jesus. The baby was stillborn. He paid her to disappear. I didn't find out until after the divorce. Lisa's hands were steady on her coffee cup. "I got nothing in the divorce, by the way. There was a prenup. Very thorough. I was young and stupid and in love. Sound familiar?" "Very," Catherine said softly. "So why did you want to meet me?" Catherine leaned forward. "I have evidence that Marcus is committing fraud, serious fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, tax evasion, enough to send him to prison for 20 years. Lisa's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "Interest. And you want to use this evidence to break the prenup. I want to use it to destroy him. Those are different things." "Not to me." Lisa was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, and it was the coldest smile Catherine had ever seen. "I've been waiting 10 years for someone to take Marcus Thorne down. Tell me how I can help." Over the next 3 months, Catherine and Lisa built a plan. Lisa had evidence of her own, financial documents she'd kept from her marriage, proof that Marcus had hidden assets even back then. Together, they had a timeline of fraud stretching back a decade. But they didn't go to the authorities. Not yet. Because Catherine had realized something important. If Marcus went to prison, his assets would be frozen. The government would seize everything in the legal battle. Catherine would end up with nothing anyway. Just a longer wait and more lawyers. No, Catherine needed Marcus to give her Trident Holdings first. She needed him to transfer the LLC to her, legally and completely. And then, once she had it, once she owned the evidence of his crimes, she'd burn his world to the ground. It's risky, Lisa warned. If he figures out what you're doing before you get the transfer, he'll move the money, destroy the evidence, disappear. He won't figure it out, Catherine said, because I'm going to give him exactly what he wants, which is me, broken and desperate and willing to settle for scraps. It wasn't hard to play the part. Catherine was broken. She was desperate. She just wasn't willing to settle. She started acting erratic. She'd call Marcus at work, crying, begging him to reconsider the divorce. She showed up at his office once, disheveled and weeping, asking to talk. She sent rambling texts at 3 in the morning. She played the role of unstable ex-wife so well that Marcus's friends started commenting on it. "Catherine's not handling this well," she overheard Marcus say on the phone one night. He sounded almost pleased. "I think she might need professional help." Perfect. Let him think she was falling apart. Let him think she was weak. She started drinking during the day, just enough that he'd smell it when he came home. She stopped doing her hair. She wore sweatpants and old t-shirts. She looked like someone who'd given up. And then, 2 weeks before the scheduled divorce mediation, she made her move. She showed up at his lawyer's office, unannounced, looking like she'd slept in her clothes. Gerald, the lawyer, seemed alarmed to see her. "Mrs. Thorne, you really should go through your attorney." "I don't have an attorney," Catherine said. This was a lie. She'd hired Ruth Morrison, one of the best divorce lawyers in Boston, but Ruth was operating in the shadows, preparing documents Catherine would need later. "I can't afford one. Marcus knows that. He's counting on it." Gerald shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sorry, but I can't speak with you directly if you're represented by counsel." "I'm not. I just need to understand something." Catherine pulled out the divorce papers, pointed to the settlement terms. "This says I get the townhouse, but it's mortgaged for more than it's worth. And the $250,000, that'll be eaten up by taxes and my credit card debt. I'll have nothing." "The prenuptial agreement is very clear." "I know. I signed it. I'm not trying to change anything." Catherine looked up at him, let her eyes fill with tears that weren't entirely fake. "I just want one thing, something small. For me." "What thing?" "The car, the Porsche, the blue one he keeps in that garage downtown. I know it's stupid, but we bought it together, or I thought we did. I helped him pick it out. It's the only thing that feels like mine." Gerald's expression shifted from wary to pitying. Here was the crazy ex-wife asking for a car because of sentimental value. This was the kind of thing that made sense to him. "I can ask Mr. Thorne," he said carefully. "It's registered to some LLC, Trident Holdings. Could you just have him sign that over to me? I don't want anything else. I'll sign the divorce papers today if he does this one thing." Gerald made a note. "I'll discuss it with my client." Catherine left the office and threw up in the parking garage from sheer nerves. But it worked. She'd planted the seed. Now she just had to wait. Marcus called her that night. "Gerald says you want the Porsche." "Yes." "Why?" "Because you took everything else." Her voice cracked. "My career, my family, my life. Just let me have this one thing, please." Marcus was quiet. She could hear him calculating, trying to figure out her angle. But he couldn't see one because the request was so stupid, so emotional, so exactly what a broken woman would ask for. "Fine," he said. "You can have the stupid car, but you sign the papers tomorrow. No more delays." "Okay," Catherine whispered. "And Catherine, this is the last time we talk. After tomorrow, we're done. You go your way, I go mine, and we pretend this marriage never happened." "Okay," she said again. She hung up and let herself cry. Real tears this time. Not because she was sad, because she'd won. The next day, she walked into that conference room, signed the divorce papers with a smile, and watched Marcus sign over Trident Holdings LLC without realizing he'd just given her the weapon that would destroy him. Catherine drove Jenny's Camry to the storage unit in South Boston she'd rented 3 months earlier. The unit was climate-controlled, 10 by 10, and cost $123 a month she'd paid in cash. Inside, under a gray tarp, sat Marcus's midnight blue Porsche 918 Spyder. Getting the car out of Marcus's private garage had been surprisingly easy. Catherine had the title transfer documents, legally signed and notarized. She'd shown up at the garage with a tow truck driver named Miguel, who asked no questions as long as the cash was green. They'd loaded the Porsche onto the flatbed, driven it across town, and tucked it away where Marcus would never think to look. That was 4 days ago. Marcus still didn't know the car was gone. He probably hadn't even thought about it. He was too busy with Maya, planning whatever life they thought they'd have together. Now Catherine stood in the storage unit, looking at the car that was worth more than most people would make in a lifetime. It was beautiful, she'd give it that. Sleek and low and powerful, the kind of machine that screamed money and status, and look at what I can afford. She hated it, but more importantly, she owned it. And more importantly than that, she owned the LLC that held it, which meant she owned the bank accounts attached to that LLC, which meant she owned the evidence of every crime Marcus had committed for the past 3 years. Her phone buzzed, a text from Lisa. "Status?" Catherine typed back. "Car secured, ready for phase 2. "Are you sure about this?" "Yes." Catherine had spent the last 3 days moving pieces into place like a chess master arranging an endgame. She'd opened new bank accounts under the Trident Holdings name, transferring signature authority to herself. She'd downloaded every financial record, every email, every scrap of evidence from the LLC's servers before Marcus could think to check them. She'd compiled everything into a dossier so thorough, so damning, that no lawyer alive could defend against it. And then she'd made copies. Lots of copies. One copy went to Ruth Morrison, her lawyer, with instructions to hold it in escrow. One copy went to a safe deposit box at a bank in New Hampshire. One copy went to Lisa. And one copy, the most important copy, went into a package addressed to the Securities and Exchange Commission's Boston office, to an investigator named Sarah Chen, who specialized in startup fraud. But Catherine didn't mail that package. Not yet. Because she'd realized something in her months of investigation. Something that gave her pause. If she destroyed Marcus, if she sent him to prison, she'd be destroying everything connected to him. Vortex Solutions would collapse. The company employed 347 people, according to their website. Administrative assistants and software engineers and sales reps who had nothing to do with Marcus's crimes but whose jobs would evaporate when the company went under. Maya would be collateral damage too. She'd tied her reputation to Marcus, moved into the apartment he was paying for, quit her nonprofit job to focus on their relationship. When Marcus fell, Maya would fall with him. Catherine spent a long night thinking about that, about collateral damage and justice, and whether revenge was worth the cost. And then she remembered something her father had told her once, years ago. She'd been maybe 10 years old, and a girl at school had been bullying her. Catherine had wanted to fight back, but she'd been scared. "Baby," her dad had said, "sometimes the right thing isn't the easy thing, and sometimes people have to face consequences, even if it hurts, even if it hurts other people too, because if they don't, they'll just keep doing harm." Marcus had been doing harm for years, to her, to Lisa, to how many other women, to the investors he was defrauding, to the employees whose retirement accounts were funded by money he was embezzling. Justice wasn't clean, justice was messy and complicated, and sometimes good people got hurt, but it was still justice. Catherine sealed the package to the SEC. Then she drove to the post office on Boylston Street, bought insurance and tracking, and sent it priority overnight. The package would arrive tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. She had 24 hours. Catherine spent that time moving money. Not the embezzled funds, she wouldn't touch those. That was evidence. But the car, that was hers. Legally purchased by an LLC she now owned. She'd found a buyer 3 weeks ago, a collector in Dubai, who'd been following the Porsche's build process online and was devastated when it went to a private buyer. When Catherine had reached out through an intermediary, offering to sell, he jumped at the chance. $4.1 million. That was his offer. The car's appreciation and the story behind it, custom built for a tech billionaire, now owned by his ex-wife, made it worth more than the original $3.8 million. Catherine accepted the offer. She arranged transport through a private shipping company that specialized in high-value vehicles. The car would be picked up from the storage unit tomorrow afternoon, loaded into a climate-controlled container, and shipped to Dubai. The money would be wired to an account Catherine had set up in her name, completely separate from anything Marcus could touch. $4.1 million, enough to restart her life. Enough to fund the nonprofit she wanted to start, helping women escape financial abuse. Enough to matter. But first, she had to survive the next 24 hours. Because once the SEC received that package, once they started digging, Marcus would know. He'd figure out who'd sent it, and he'd come after her with everything he had. Catherine went back to the townhouse. Technically, it was hers now, according to the divorce settlement, though Marcus was still living there. He'd been staying in the guest suite, and they'd been avoiding each other carefully. The house was big enough that they could go days without crossing paths. She found him in the living room on the phone, laughing about something. He looked up when she walked in, and his expression went cold. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone, then hung up. "What do you want?" "I'm moving out tomorrow," Catherine said. "I wanted you to know." "Good. Take your things and go." "I'm taking the car." "What car?" "The Porsche. From the garage. I already moved it." Marcus's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, then realization, then fury. "You took the car. You signed over the LLC. The car was registered to the LLC, so yes, I took it. It's mine." "You stupid." He stood up, advancing on her. Catherine held her ground. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I know exactly what I've done." Marcus was close enough now that she could smell his cologne, the expensive stuff he bought at Saks. "Give it back, right now. Give me the car and I won't press charges." "Press charges for what? Taking my own property?" "That car is collateral on a loan, a $50 million loan. If the lender finds out it's gone, if they think I've moved it or sold it." His voice had gone thin with panic. "Catherine, you don't understand. These aren't people you mess with." "You mean Sergei Volkov?" Marcus went white. "How do you know that name?" "I know a lot of things, Marcus. I know about the embezzlement. I know about the money laundering. I know about every crime you've committed for the past 3 years. And tomorrow morning, so will the CC." The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus stared at her like he'd never seen her before. "What did you do?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I did what I had to do. I survived you." Catherine picked up her purse from the side table. "The car is gone, sold. The money from the sale is mine. And every piece of evidence I compiled is on its way to federal investigators. By this time tomorrow, your life as you know it will be over." "You can't do this." "I already did." Marcus lunged for her. Catherine was ready. She'd taken self-defense classes for the past 2 months, paid for with money from selling jewelry he'd given her. She sidestepped his grab, pulled out her phone, and held it up. "I'm recording this. You touch me, and that's assault on video. Do you really want to add that to your list of problems?" Marcus froze. His hands were shaking. She'd never seen him lose control like this, and part of her was terrified, but a larger part was coldly satisfied. "I gave you everything," he said. "I took you out of that pathetic museum job. I gave you a life. You gave me a cage. There's a difference. I loved you, Billionaire." "No, you didn't. You never did. I was a thing you owned, like that car, like this house, like everything else in your life that you think makes you important." Catherine headed for the door. "Goodbye, Marcus. Enjoy prison." She walked out of the townhouse and didn't look back. She got in Jenny's Camry and drove to the hotel where she'd booked a room under her maiden name. She'd moved all her important possessions there over the past week. Everything that mattered fitting into 3 suitcases and a backpack. Amazing how little she actually needed from 8 years of marriage. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay in the hotel bed, watching the ceiling, waiting for her phone to ring, for Marcus to show up with lawyers or worse. But nothing happened. The night passed in quiet darkness. At 8:30 the next morning, her phone buzzed. A text from Lisa. "It's happening." Catherine turned on the TV, flipped to the local news. The anchor was mid-sentence talking about breaking news at Vortex Solutions. Federal agents raided the offices early this morning in what sources say is part of a securities fraud investigation. The company's CEO, Marcus Thorne, was taken into custody at his Beacon Hill home at approximately 6 a.m. We'll continue to follow this developing story. Catherine turned off the TV. It was done. Her phone rang. Ruth Morrison, her lawyer. "Did you see the news?" Ruth asked. "I saw." "Catherine, I need you to be very careful right now. Marcus is going to realize you're involved. He'll come after you." "Let him try. Everything I did was legal. I reported a crime. I transferred an asset that was legally mine. He has no case against me." "That doesn't mean he won't make your life hell. He already did that. For 8 years. I'm not afraid of him anymore." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You're stronger than I thought." "I had to be." The next few days were a blur. The news coverage was relentless. Marcus's arrest was everywhere. Vortex Solutions stock tanked. Investors filed lawsuits. The embezzlement scheme unraveled in spectacular fashion, revealing a web of fraud that went back further than even Catherine had documented. And then there was Maya. Catherine's phone had been blowing up with calls from her sister, all of which she'd ignored. Finally, Maya showed up at the hotel. Catherine had expected this. She'd hoped to avoid it, but she'd known her sister wouldn't give up. "You destroyed him," Maya said when Catherine opened the door. Her eyes were red from crying. "You destroyed us." "I destroyed a criminal," Catherine said evenly. "Marcus made his choices. He's facing the consequences. He loves me. We were going to get married." "He doesn't love you, Maya. He doesn't love anyone. He used you to hurt me, and it worked. But he would have done the same thing to you eventually. You were just next in line. I guess. You're jealous." Catherine actually laughed. "I'm not jealous. I'm free. There's a difference." She paused. "But I am sorry. I'm sorry that you got caught up in this. I'm sorry that you made choices that hurt both of us. And I'm sorry that you'll probably hate me for a long time." "Probably forever," Maya said, her voice breaking. "That's fair." Catherine's throat was tight. "But I hope someday you'll understand that I did this to survive. And maybe it'll save you too, even if you can't see it now." Maya left without another word. Catherine closed the door and finally let herself cry. Not for Marcus, not for the marriage, but for her sister and for the relationship they'd probably never get back. 2 weeks later, Catherine sat in a small office in Cambridge with Lisa Chen and a woman named Diane who'd taken the bus down from Somerville. They were drafting bylaws for a new nonprofit organization, a foundation to help women escape financial abuse, to provide legal support and resources and education. They were calling it the Trident Foundation. A little bit of dark humor, but Catherine liked the symmetry. The weapon that nearly destroyed her, transformed into something that would help others. "We'll need funding," Diane said, ever practical. "Grants, donors, that kind of thing." "I have $4 million, Catherine said, "from the car sale. That's our seed money." Lisa looked at her. "That's your fresh start money, your life restart money." "This is my fresh start. This matters more than anything else I could do with it." Catherine pulled up the website mock-up she'd been working on. "We'll offer free legal consultations, financial planning help, temporary housing assistance, everything I wish I'd had." "What about you?" Diane asked. "What will you do for money?" "I'm going back to school. Ruth Morrison offered me a job at her firm once I get my JD. I'll be a law student who runs a nonprofit. I'll be busy." Catherine smiled. "I'll be happy." The next few months passed in a kind of controlled chaos. Marcus was indicted on 14 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. The trial was set for the following year. Maya moved back to Florida and blocked Catherine's number. Her parents called once, confused and hurt, and Catherine tried to explain. They didn't really understand, but they said they loved her anyway. Jenny threw her a divorce party that was really just the two of them eating pizza and watching bad movies. "I'm proud of you," Jenny said. "You're a badass." "I'm a survivor," Catherine corrected. "There's a difference." The Trident Foundation launched in January with a small office, a part-time staff, and a wait list of women who needed help. Catherine worked 16-hour days and loved every minute of it. She was making a difference. She was using what had happened to her, all that pain and humiliation and rage, and turning it into something useful. Marcus's trial began in March. Catherine didn't attend. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. He was convicted on 12 of the 14 counts and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Catherine learned about the verdict from a news alert on her phone. She was in the foundation office reviewing intake forms when the notification popped up. She read it once, then set her phone down and went back to work. That night, Ruth Morrison called her. "It's over. He's done." "I know. How do you feel?" Catherine thought about it. Tired, relieved, sad maybe. Not for him, for the time I lost, for the person I was before I met him. "You can't get that time back," Ruth said gently, "but you can decide what comes next." I already did. 6 months after Marcus went to prison, Catherine got a letter. It was forwarded through 3 different addresses before it reached her, and the return address was a facility in Pennsylvania. It was from Marcus. Catherine almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity won out. She opened it at her kitchen table in the small apartment she'd rented in Somerville, a 1-bedroom with a view of a parking lot that cost $800 a month and felt like a palace because it was hers. The letter was short. "Catherine, I know you'll probably never forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness. But I want you to know that I've had a lot of time to think, and I understand now what I did to you. All of it. The control, the cruelty, the betrayal. I told myself I loved you, but love doesn't look like what I did. I destroyed you because I could, because it made me feel powerful. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't give you back those years. But I needed to say it. You deserve better. You always did. Marcus." Catherine read the letter twice. Then she put it in a drawer and never looked at it again, because sorry didn't fix anything. Sorry didn't erase the trauma or the years she'd lost or the person she'd had to become to survive him. But it didn't matter anymore. Marcus's apology, his guilt, his understanding, none of it mattered. She'd already moved on. The Monday morning after Marcus's sentencing, Catherine woke up to 347 emails. The Trident Foundation's website had crashed from traffic overnight. Apparently, the story of the tech CEO's ex-wife who'd brought him down had gone viral. News outlets were calling her a hero. Social media was calling her an icon. Catherine just wanted to drink her coffee in peace. Her phone rang at 7:30 a.m. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Is this Catherine Brown?" A woman's voice, professional and cautious. "Speaking." "My name is Sandra Reeves. I was married to Marcus Thorne. Before Lisa. Before you." Catherine sat down hard on her cheap IKEA couch. "I'm sorry, what?" "I know this is a shock. Marcus liked to pretend I never existed. We were married for 2 years, right out of college. I was 22. He was 24. I signed a prenup that gave me nothing when he cheated on me with one of his business school classmates." Sandra's voice was steady, like she'd rehearsed this. "I saw the news about the trial, about your foundation. I wanted to reach out." "How did you find me?" "Your foundation's website has a contact form. I left a message last night. But then I saw you listed your personal consulting business on LinkedIn, and I found this number. I hope that's okay." Catherine rubbed her temples. "Wife number 0. Of course there was a wife number 0. "It's fine. I'm just processing. Are you okay? Do you need help?" "No, I'm fine now. I rebuilt my life. I'm a CPA in Chicago, married to a good man, 2 kids, the whole suburban dream." Sandra paused. "But it took me 10 years to get here. 10 years of therapy and debt and feeling worthless. And when I saw what you did, how you fought back, I needed to tell you thank you." "You don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do. Because women like me, women like Lisa, we've been watching men like Marcus get away with this for our entire lives. And you stopped him. You actually stopped him." Sandra's voice cracked. "I wish I'd been brave enough to do that." "You survived. That's brave." They talked for another hour. Sandra had stories that made Catherine's blood boil. Marcus had been abusing women for over a decade, maybe longer. Each relationship following the same pattern. Love bombing, isolation, control, betrayal, the prenup that left them with nothing. And then he'd move on to the next one, leaving destruction in his wake. "Have you talked to Lisa?" Catherine asked. "I tried to find her years ago, but she'd changed her name after the divorce. I didn't blame her. I did the same thing." "I'll connect you. And Sandra, If you ever want to share your story for the Foundation's website or for advocacy work, we'd be honored to have you. I'll think about it. After they hung up, Catherine sat in her living room and stared at nothing for a long time. 3 wives, 3 women whose lives Marcus had systematically destroyed. How many others were there? Girlfriends? Co-workers? Women whose stories would never be told because they hadn't had the resources or the evidence or the rage to fight back? The Foundation's crashed website suddenly felt more important than ever. Catherine spent the rest of the day fielding calls, reporters wanting interviews, women wanting help, lawyers wanting to discuss partnerships. By 5 p.m., she was exhausted and starving, and her phone was at 2% battery. That's when Maya called. Catherine stared at her sister's name on the screen. She hadn't talked to Maya in 8 months, not since that awful confrontation at the hotel. Catherine's thumb hovered over the decline button. She answered. Maya. Kath. Her sister's voice was small. I know you probably don't want to talk to me. I don't blame you, but I saw the news about Marcus, and I need to tell you something. Okay. You were right about all of it. Maya was crying now. He didn't love me. He never loved me. I was just another way to hurt you, and I was too stupid to see it. You weren't stupid, you were young. He was a predator. I moved back to Florida after he got arrested. I'm back in school, finishing my counseling degree. I'm in therapy, a lot of therapy. Maya took a shaky breath. And I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix what I did. I know I betrayed you in the worst way possible, but I'm so sorry. Catherine closed her eyes. She'd imagined this conversation 100 times. In some versions, she was cold and unforgiving. In others, she was gracious and kind. But now that it was happening, she just felt tired. I forgive you, Catherine said, and she was surprised to find she meant it. I don't know if we can ever be what we were, but I forgive you. I don't deserve that. Maybe not, but I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for me, because I can't carry that anger anymore. It's too heavy. They talked for a while longer. Maya told her about therapy, about working through her issues with male attention and self-worth, about realizing she'd been groomed even though she'd been 24 and thought she was too old to fall for that. He made me feel special, Maya said. He made me feel like I was the only person who understood him, like we had this deep connection. He did the same thing to me, Catherine said, and to Lisa, and to at least one other woman we didn't even know existed. It's what he does. It's what they all do. How do you spot them? The predators? Catherine thought about Diane's advice from the psychiatric ward. She thought about everything she'd learned in the past year. They rush intimacy. They isolate you from friends and family. They make you financially dependent. They dismiss your expertise while praising your beauty. They have enemies or exes who are all supposedly crazy. And most importantly, they make you feel like you're the problem. Catherine paused. And if you think you might be in a relationship like that, you probably are. Trust your gut. I wish someone had told me that before. I'm telling you now, and you can tell the next person. That's how we stop them. After Maya hung up, Catherine sat in the gathering darkness of her apartment and felt something shift. The anger she'd been carrying, the weight of betrayal and rage and grief, it wasn't gone, but it was lighter. Forgiveness, she was learning, wasn't about letting people off the hook. It was about putting down the weight you'd been carrying so you could move forward. The next morning, Catherine drove to a medium-security prison in Pennsylvania. She'd been putting this off for weeks, but it was time. She had things to say. Marcus looked smaller in prison. That was Catherine's first thought when they brought him into the visiting room. He'd always been tall, imposing, taking up space like it was his right. But in the orange jumpsuit, without his expensive suits and his confident swagger, he just looked like a middle-aged man who'd made very bad choices. Catherine. He sat down across from her, his hands folded on the table. I didn't think you'd come. I almost didn't. Why did you? Because I need closure, and because I have questions. Marcus nodded slowly. Did you ever love me, even in the beginning? He was quiet for a long time. I don't know, I thought I did. But I don't think I understand what love actually is. I think I liked owning you. I liked that you were smart and beautiful, and I'd rescued you from your small life. I liked the way other men looked at you when we walked into a room together. He met her eyes. But that's not love. That's possession. No, it's not. Catherine took a breath. Why me? Why any of us? Because you were easy to control. Not stupid. I never thought you were stupid, no matter what I said, but vulnerable. You had debt, limited options, a desperate need to believe in something good. I could swoop in and be your hero. His voice was flat, matter of fact. And when you started to push back, when you started to want more independence, I couldn't handle it. So I'd cheat, I'd gaslight, I'd make you so small that you'd stay. Did you know what you were doing? Or did you actually believe your own justifications? Both, neither. I knew I was hurting you. I told myself you deserved it for not being what I needed, for gaining weight, for being tired, for having opinions. Marcus looked down at his hands. The truth is, I hated myself, and I made you hate yourself too. That's what abusers do. Yes, it is. Catherine pulled out a folder from her bag. I need you to sign something. What is it? A sworn affidavit documenting everything you did, the emotional abuse, the financial control, the affairs, all of it. I'm working with state legislator to strengthen laws around financial abuse and coercive control. Your testimony would help. You want me to confess to everything. You already confessed. You're in prison. This just makes it official for legal purposes. It helps other women. Marcus took the papers, read them slowly. Then he picked up the pen Catherine offered. I'll sign, he said, not because it makes us even. Nothing makes us even, but because you're right. If this helps someone else, it's the least I can do. He signed his name at the bottom of each page. Catherine witnessed the signatures, then tucked the folder back into her bag. Thank you, she said. I got your letter, the one you sent after the sentencing. I didn't send you a letter. Yes, you did. It said, I forgive you, but I'll never forget. Catherine frowned. Marcus, I didn't send that. Then who? His eyes widened. Lisa. Probably. Catherine stood. Goodbye, Marcus. Catherine, wait. He looked up at her, and for the first time she saw something genuine in his face. Regret, maybe, or just the weight of consequences. For what it's worth, I am sorry. I know that doesn't help, but I am. I know, I got your letter, the real one. Catherine picked up her bag. But sorry isn't enough. It never is. What matters is what comes next. What you do with your 15 years. Whether you actually change or just feel sorry for yourself. What do you want me to do? I want you to help other men understand what you did and why you did it. I want you to talk to prison counselors about patterns of abuse. I want you to use your experience to prevent the next Marcus Thorne. Catherine paused at the door. And I want you to leave me alone. After today we were done. I've moved on. You should too. She walked out without looking back. On the drive home, Catherine called Lisa. Did you send Marcus a letter pretending to be me? Lisa laughed. Maybe. Did it work? He thought I'd forgiven him. You did forgive him. I was at the foundation meeting when you said that. Forgiving him doesn't mean I want him to feel forgiven. There's a difference. Noted. I won't forge your signature again. See that you don't? They hung up, and Catherine smiled despite herself. She had allies now, friends who understood what she'd been through because they'd been through it too. She wasn't alone anymore. The Trident Foundation grew faster than Catherine had anticipated. Within 6 months, they'd helped 43 women escape abusive situations. They'd provided legal consultations, financial planning, temporary housing assistance. They'd partnered with law firms and therapists and women's shelters across New England. And Catherine had started law school. She was the oldest person in her class by a decade, but she didn't care. She sat in the front row, took meticulous notes, and absorbed everything like her life depended on it. Because in a way, it did. This was her purpose now. This was what she'd been through hell to find. 1 year after Marcus's conviction, Catherine gave her first public speech. It was at a conference on domestic violence prevention in Boston. The auditorium held 300 people, and Catherine was terrified. But she walked up to that podium, looked out at the sea of faces, and told her story. My name is Catherine Brown, she said, and I'm a survivor of financial abuse and coercive control. She talked about the isolation, the manipulation, the systematic destruction of her identity. She talked about the prenup that was designed to trap her. She talked about learning to fight back, to document everything, to build a case. I'm not a hero, she said. I'm just someone who got lucky. I had resources, education, friends who didn't give up on me. Most women don't have that. Most women are stuck in situations where leaving means losing everything, including custody of their children. Most women can't afford lawyers or therapists or the time it takes to build an escape plan. She told them about the foundation, about the work they were doing. We can't save everyone, Catherine said, but we can make sure that women have options. We can change laws that keep people trapped. We can educate young women about red flags before they sign prenups that will destroy them. We can hold abusers accountable. The applause when she finished was deafening. People stood, women cried, and Catherine felt, for the first time since this whole nightmare began, like maybe it had all meant something. Afterward, a young woman approached her. She looked like Catherine had looked at 24, bright-eyed, hopeful, terrified. Hi, the woman said. My name is Emma. I'm engaged. My fiancé wants me to sign a prenup, and I don't know what to do. It feels wrong, but I love him. Catherine took Emma's hands. Do you have a lawyer? Your own lawyer, not his? No, he says we don't need one. That's a red flag. You need independent legal counsel, someone who works for you, not him. Catherine pulled out a business card. This is my direct number. Call me tomorrow. We'll talk through your options. Thank you, Emma whispered. I didn't know who else to ask. You can always ask. That's what we're here for. That night, Catherine went home to her small apartment, fed her cat, a rescue tabby named Justice that Jenny had talked her into adopting, and sat on her couch with a glass of wine. Her phone buzzed, a text from Diane. Saw your speech online. You were magnificent. Another text from Lisa. Proud of you, warrior woman. And one from Jenny. That's my best friend. Told you that you were a badass. Catherine smiled, sipping her wine. She thought about the journey that had led here. The pain, the fear, the rage, the careful planning, and the desperate gambles. The moment she'd signed those divorce papers with a smile, knowing what was coming. It had been worth it. All of it. Because she'd survived. And now she was helping others survive too. Her phone rang. Emma, the young woman from the conference. I'm sorry to call so late, Emma said, but I couldn't wait until tomorrow. I read the prenup again tonight. Really read it. And it's exactly what you described. It gives me nothing. And I realized I don't want to marry someone who would ask me to sign this. Good, Catherine said. That's exactly right. You deserve better. I'm scared. I know, but you're also brave. You asked for help. That's the hardest part. They talked for an hour. Catherine walked Emma through next steps, gave her resources, connected her with a lawyer from the Foundation's network. When they hung up, Catherine felt that familiar sense of purpose settle over her. This was why she'd done it. Not for revenge, though that had been satisfying. Not for money, though the $4 million had helped. She'd done it so that the next woman wouldn't be alone. So that Emma and everyone like her would have a fighting chance. Just as the cat jumped onto her lap, purring, Catherine scratched behind her ears and looked around her small apartment. The second-hand furniture, the law school textbooks stacked on the coffee table, the framed photo of her and Jenny from last month's foundation fundraiser. It wasn't the Beacon Hill townhouse. It wasn't the life Marcus had promised her. It was better, because it was hers. The call came on a Wednesday in November, 2 years after Marcus went to prison. Catherine was in her civil procedure class, half listening to a lecture on personal jurisdiction, when her phone buzzed with a call from a number she didn't recognize. She ignored it. It buzzed again immediately. Then a third time. She excused herself from class and stepped into the hallway. This is Catherine. Ms. Brown, my name is Detective Sarah Martinez with the Boston PD. I need to speak with you about Marcus Thorne. Catherine's stomach dropped. Is he out? He's not supposed to be eligible for parole for another 10 years. No, he's still incarcerated, but we have a situation. Can you come to the station? 20 minutes later, Catherine sat in an interview room that smelled like bad coffee and desperation. Detective Martinez was in her 40s, with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "We've had 3 women come forward in the past month," Martinez said, sliding a file across the table. "All of them have similar stories. They met Marcus Thorne through various professional or social settings between 2000 and 2010. All of them describe relationships characterized by manipulation, financial control, and emotional abuse. 2 of them signed prenuptial agreements nearly identical to yours. One never married him but was in a relationship for 4 years." Catherine opened the file. 3 faces looked back at her. Women she'd never met, living lives parallel to hers. "Why are they coming forward now?" Catherine asked. "Because of you, your foundation's work, your advocacy. These women saw what you did and realized they weren't alone. They want to add their testimony to the record, potentially file civil suits, and they want to help with your legislative efforts." "Civil suits? Against Marcus?" "Against his estate, such as it is. But more importantly, they want their stories documented. They want to make sure he never gets early release. They want parole boards to understand the full scope of his pattern of abuse." Catherine looked at the photos again. "Can I meet them?" "They're hoping you'll say that." The meeting was arranged for the following Saturday at the Foundation's office. Catherine arrived early, nervous in a way she hadn't been in months. She'd thought she knew the full extent of Marcus's damage. She'd thought Lisa and Sandra and herself were the whole story. She'd been wrong. The 3 women arrived together. They'd found each other online, connected through a support group for financial abuse survivors. Their names were Rachel, Keisha, and Amanda. Rachel was 41, an accountant who'd dated Marcus for 3 years in the early 2000s. "He wasn't rich yet," she said. "He was still building Vortec. But the patterns were already there. He isolated me from my friends, convinced me to quit my job to help him with his startup. When I finally left, I was broke and unemployed with a 3-year gap in my resume." Keisha was 38, a former marketing executive. "I met Marcus at a conference. He swept me off my feet, proposed after 4 months. The prenup was brutal, but I signed it because I was pregnant. I had a miscarriage at 12 weeks. He left me 3 days later, said he didn't see the point of getting married anymore." Her voice was steady, but her hands shook as she held her coffee. "The prenup had a clause that, if we didn't get married, I owed him money for the ring and the wedding deposits. I was grieving my baby and fighting a lawsuit." Amanda was 35, an artist. "I never married him, thank God. But I lived with him for 4 years. He funded my art studio, my supplies, everything. And then one day he decided I wasn't grateful enough. He kicked me out with no notice, kept all my artwork, said it was his because he'd paid for the materials. I lost my entire portfolio. It took me years to rebuild my career." Catherine listened to their stories and felt rage building in her chest all over again. Marcus had been doing this for at least 15 years, maybe longer. How many women were there? How many lives had he destroyed? "I want to help," Catherine said. "Whatever you need. Legal support, testimony, advocacy. The Foundation's resources are yours." "We want more than that," Rachel said. "We want to start a class action lawsuit, not for money. Marcus doesn't have any left. But to create a legal precedent, to establish that this pattern of behavior is actionable, that prenups signed under coercion or fraud can be invalidated, that financial abuse is a crime." "That's ambitious," Catherine said. "So is bringing down a tech billionaire." Keisha smiled. "We learned from the best." Over the next 6 months, Catherine worked with Rachel, Keisha, and Amanda to build their case. They brought in Ruth Morrison and her firm to handle the legal work pro bono. They reached out to more women who'd been involved with Marcus, girlfriends, co-workers, women who'd been harassed or manipulated, or worse. By the time they filed the lawsuit, they had testimony from 11 women spanning 20 years. The case was messy and complicated and probably wouldn't result in any financial settlement. But that wasn't the point. The point was creating a record, establishing patterns, giving survivors a voice. And it worked. The trial, really more of a hearing since Marcus couldn't defend himself from prison, made national news. News outlets covered it extensively. The hashtag Justice for Thorne victims trended on Twitter. Think pieces were written about prenups and financial abuse, and the ways wealthy men weaponize the legal system. The judge ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, declaring that Marcus Thorne had engaged in a decades-long pattern of predatory behavior designed to exploit and control women. The ruling didn't award damages. There was nothing left to award, but it invalidated every prenup Marcus had ever made women sign, declaring them products of fraud and coercion. More importantly, it set a legal precedent that family courts across the country could use to evaluate prenuptial agreements. It established that financial abuse was a legitimate ground for invalidating contracts. It changed the conversation. Catherine stood on the courthouse steps after the ruling, surrounded by the 11 women who'd testified, and faced a wall of cameras and reporters. "Today is about accountability," she said. "It's about making sure that men like Marcus Thorne can't hide behind lawyers and NDAs and prenups designed to silence their victims. It's about saying that abuse is abuse, whether it's physical or financial or emotional. And it's about making sure the next generation of women knows their worth and won't accept anything less." The questions came rapid fire. How did it feel? Was she satisfied with the ruling? What came next? "What comes next," Catherine said, "is more work. We've started a conversation, but conversations don't save lives. Policy does. Law does. Education does. So we keep going. We keep fighting. We keep making sure that the Marcus Thornes of the world face real consequences." That night, the foundation held a celebration at a bar in Cambridge. All 11 women were there, plus Lisa and Sandra, plus Diane, who'd become one of the foundation's board members. Jenny showed up with champagne. Ruth Morrison brought her whole legal team. Catherine stood at the bar, watching these women laugh and talk and connect. Survivors, all of them. Warriors, all of them. "You did this," Lisa said, appearing at Catherine's elbow. "You started this chain reaction." "We did this," Catherine corrected. "All of us." "Don't be modest. It doesn't suit you." Lisa clinked her glass against Catherine's. To revenge served cold. To justice served at exactly the right temperature. They drank to that. The foundation grew exponentially after the trial. Donations poured in. Women reached out from across the country asking for help. Catherine hired a full staff: therapists, lawyers, financial advisors, case managers. They moved into a larger office. They opened satellite offices in 3 other cities. And Catherine graduated from law school. She was 34 years old, sitting in her cap and gown surrounded by 22-year-olds, and she'd never been prouder of anything in her life. Her parents had flown up from Florida. Jenny was there, screaming Catherine's name when she walked across the stage. Even Maya had come. Their relationship still fragile but healing. After the ceremony, Catherine's father pulled her aside. He was 68 now, his hair completely gray, his hands rough from a lifetime of construction work. "I'm proud of you, baby girl," he said. "Not just for this," he gestured at her diploma, "but for everything, for surviving, for fighting back, for helping all those other women. I learned from you, Dad. You always said stand up to bullies. I also said be careful and think things through first." He smiled. "You definitely got the standing up part down, maybe a little too well. There's no such thing as standing up too well." Fair point. That night, Ruth Morrison offered Catherine a position at her firm. "You're hired," Ruth said over celebratory drinks. $48,000 a year starting salary, benefits, all the coffee you can drink." "48,000? Catherine raised an eyebrow. "I can get 55 at the public defender's office." "True, but you'll get better at mentorship here, more interesting cases, and you can keep running the foundation on the side. We'll make sure you have the flexibility." Ruth leaned back. "Plus, I like you. You're ruthless in exactly the right ways." Catherine accepted the job. The next few years were a blur of work. Catherine split her time between the law firm, where she specialized in family law and civil rights cases, and the foundation, which continued expanding its reach. She wrote op-eds about financial abuse. She testified before state legislatures about strengthening domestic violence laws. She became a reluctant public figure, the face of a movement she'd never intended to start. And through it all, she stayed single. People asked about her love life constantly. Reporters, friends, well-meaning strangers at foundation events. When was she going to date again? Didn't she want to find love? Wasn't she lonely? I'm not lonely, Katharina would say. I'm busy. There's a difference. But late at night, alone in the apartment she'd upgraded to a slightly bigger apartment, she'd sometimes wonder, would she ever be able to trust someone again? Would she ever want to? The answer came unexpectedly, as answers often do. Catherine was at a foundation fundraiser, schmoozing with donors and trying not to spill wine on her dress when someone tapped her shoulder. "Excuse me, are you Catherine Brown?" She turned. The woman was maybe 40, with dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that held that particular combination of intelligence and kindness that Catherine had learned to recognize in fellow survivors. "I am. And you are?" "Dr. Sarah Chen. I'm the SEC investigator who handled the Marcus Thorne case." Catherine's eyes widened. "You're the Sarah Chen? I sent you the evidence package." "You did. Best documented case I've ever received. Saved us months of investigative work." Sarah smiled. "I've been following your foundation's work. It's impressive." They talked for over an hour, tucked into a corner away from the noise of the party. Sarah told her about her job at the SEC, about the challenges of prosecuting financial crimes when the victims were often too scared or ashamed to come forward. Catherine told her about the foundation's work, about their legislative advocacy, about the women they'd helped. "Can I buy you coffee sometime?" Sarah asked as the party was winding down. "I'd love to pick your brain about some patterns we're seeing in startup fraud. The financial abuse angle is something we need to understand better." "Sure," Catherine said, and meant it as professional networking. But coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into a museum date. Sarah was an art history minor in college and loved Catherine's insights on the Renaissance collection. Museum dates turned into weekend hikes and movie nights, and slowly, carefully, Catherine found herself opening up to someone new. "I need you to know," Catherine said one night, 3 months into whatever this was, "I have a lot of baggage. Like an entire matching luggage set of trauma and trust issues." "I know," Sarah said. "I read the case file, remember? I know what he did to you. And you still want to do this, whatever this is?" "I want to do this, whatever this is." Sarah took her hand. "But we go slow, we communicate, and the moment you feel uncomfortable or scared or like I'm crossing a line, you tell me. Deal?" Deal. It wasn't easy. Catherine had panic attacks the first time Sarah raised her voice during a disagreement. She had to fight the urge to check Sarah's phone or financial records. She had to relearn what healthy looked like. But Sarah was patient and kind, and she never made Catherine feel like her trauma was a burden. "You know what the difference is?" Catherine said one night, a year into their relationship. They were cooking dinner together in Sarah's kitchen, and Catherine had just realized she felt safe. Really, genuinely safe. "What's the difference? You ask permission. You give me choices. You don't try to manage me or fix me or control me. You just let me be myself." "That's not special," Sarah said, stirring pasta sauce. "That's basic respect. For you, maybe. For me, it's revolutionary." They moved in together after 2 years. A small house in Jamaica Plain with a yard for Justice the cat and a spare room Catherine turned into a home office for foundation work. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't a Beacon Hill townhouse. It was perfect. 5 years after Marcus went to prison, Catherine got a letter from the parole board. Marcus was applying for early release based on good behavior and participation in rehabilitation programs. The board wanted victim impact statements. Catherine stared at the letter for a long time. "You don't have to respond," Sarah said, reading over her shoulder. "You don't owe them anything." "I know, but I want to." Catherine pulled out her laptop. "He needs to stay in prison, not for revenge, for safety. He's too dangerous to be released early." Catherine wrote a 6-page statement detailing Marcus's pattern of abuse, his manipulation tactics, the psychological damage he'd inflicted on multiple women across 2 decades. She attached letters from the other survivors, from therapists who treated his victims, from the judge who'd presided over the civil case. "Marcus Thorne is a serial abuser," but Catherine wrote in her conclusion. "He is intelligent, charismatic, and utterly without empathy. He has shown no genuine remorse, only regret at being caught. 5 years is not enough time for him to have fundamentally changed the thought patterns and behaviors that led him to destroy so many lives. I urge this board to deny his parole application and require him to serve his full sentence. The parole board denied Marcus's application. He wouldn't be eligible again for another 5 years. Catherine felt relief, not satisfaction. This wasn't a victory, it was just necessary. That same year, the foundation achieved something remarkable. Working with a coalition of women's rights organizations, they successfully lobbied for new legislation in Massachusetts. The Coercive Control Act made financial abuse and psychological manipulation legally actionable in family court. It established criteria for evaluating prenuptial agreements for signs of coercion. It created pathways for victims to escape abusive situations with legal and financial support. The bill's signing ceremony was held at the State House. Catherine stood with Rachel, Keisha, Amanda, Lisa, Sandra, Diane, and 30 other women whose names the public would never know, but whose testimony had made this possible. The governor, a woman who'd made domestic violence prevention a cornerstone of her administration, signed the bill with 12 different pens, handing one to each woman present. "This is your law," the governor said. "You wrote it with your courage. You fought for it with your truth, and you'll enforce it with your continued advocacy. Thank you." Catherine held her pen like it was made of gold. In a way, it was. This pen represented years of pain transformed into purpose, trauma transformed into change. This was her legacy, not the revenge plot that had brought down Marcus Thorne, but the work that came after. The boring, difficult, essential work of changing systems and policies and laws. That night, the foundation held another celebration, smaller this time, just the core team and their partners. Catherine gave a toast. "When I started this foundation," she said, "I thought I was doing it to help other women avoid what happened to me, and that's part of it. But I realize now I was also doing it to help myself, to prove that what happened to me mattered, that my pain wasn't wasted, that I could take the worst experience of my life and turn it into something good." She looked around the room at these faces she knew so well now. Survivors who'd become friends, friends who'd become family. "We've helped 372 women in 5 years," Catherine continued. 372 women who are free now, who have options, who know they're not alone. That's not just a number. That's 372 lives changed. 372 futures that look different than they would have otherwise. And that matters. That's everything. "To the foundation," Lisa called out, raising her glass. "To the foundation," everyone echoed it. "To us," Catherine added softly. The following year brought more changes. Catherine made partner at Ruth Morrison's firm. The foundation opened 3 more offices in different states. Catherine wrote a book about her experience, not sensationalizing the revenge plot, but focusing on the systematic nature of financial abuse and how to recognize it early. The book became a bestseller, not because people wanted a revenge fantasy, but because so many women saw themselves in Catherine's story. The isolation, the control, the feeling of being trapped with no way out. Catherine went on a book tour, speaking at universities and women's shelters and corporate events. She talked about red flags. She talked about prenups and financial literacy. She talked about the importance of keeping your own bank account, your own friends, your own identity. "I'm not saying don't get married," Catherine would say at these events. "I'm saying don't disappear. Don't make yourself so small that you forget who you were before him. Don't sign legal documents without understanding them. Don't give someone else complete control over your financial future. Love shouldn't require you to make yourself vulnerable to destruction." At a speaking event in Chicago, a young woman approached Catherine during the Q&A. "You said you smiled when you signed the divorce papers," the woman said. "Why? Weren't you scared?" Catherine thought about that moment in the conference room. Marcus dismissing her for the last time, the weight of the pen in her hand. "I smiled," Catherine said, "because I knew something he didn't. I knew I'd already won. Not because I had a revenge plot in place, though I did, but because I'd stopped being afraid of him. Fear was his weapon, and I'd taken it away. That smile was me taking back my power." "How did you stop being afraid?" "By doing the work, by building a plan, by remembering that I was smart and capable and worthy, even though he'd spent years trying to convince me otherwise. Catherine leaned forward. Fear loses its power when you stare it down and realize it's just a feeling, not a fact. He couldn't actually destroy me. Only I could do that, and I chose not to. The woman nodded, tears in her eyes. After the event, she approached Catherine with a business card. I run a women's shelter here in Chicago. Would you consider opening a foundation office here? We could really use your resources. Send me a proposal, Catherine said. 6 months later, the Trident Foundation opened its 7th office in Chicago, with Rachel as the director. The network was growing, reaching more women, creating more change. And through it all, Catherine kept living her life. She and Sarah adopted a second cat, a tiny black kitten they named Justice too. They took vacations, real vacations where Catherine didn't check work email and actually relaxed. They hosted dinner parties. They were normal, or as normal as you could be when you were a public figure known for taking down a billionaire. On the 8th anniversary of her divorce, Catherine received an email from an unexpected source, Marcus. The subject line read, "No response needed." Catherine almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity won out. Catherine, I know I have no right to contact you. I know you've moved on and built an incredible life, but I wanted you to know that I've been following the foundation's work from in here. I've seen the legislation you've gotten passed, the women you've helped. I've read your book, and I've been thinking a lot about the damage I caused, not just to you, but to all those other women. I've been working with the prison psychologist on understanding my patterns of behavior. They tell me I have narcissistic personality disorder, possibly sociopathic tendencies. That doesn't excuse what I did. Nothing excuses it, but it helps me understand it. I'm not the same person I was. I don't expect you to believe that or care, but I wanted you to know that your work matters, the foundation matters, and I'm genuinely sorry for everything I put you through. I hope you're happy. I hope you found peace. You deserve it. Marcus. Catherine read the email twice. Then she showed it to Sarah. What do you think? Sarah asked. I think he means it, which is good, I guess. Catherine closed her laptop. But it doesn't change anything. Sorry doesn't undo damage. It's just words. Are you going to respond? No, he said no response needed, and he's right. I don't need to forgive him or acknowledge his growth or give him closure. That's not my job anymore. Catherine looked at Sarah. My job is living well. My job is helping other women live well too. His redemption arc, if that's what this is, doesn't require my participation. I love you, Sarah said. I love you too. That night, Catherine went through her files from the Marcus years, the screenshots, the financial records, the evidence she'd compiled so carefully. She'd kept it all, just in case. But she didn't need it anymore. Marcus was in prison. The foundation was thriving. The work was done. She deleted the files, all of them, years of documentation, gone in seconds. Are you sure? Sarah asked, watching from the doorway. I'm sure. I don't need to carry this anymore. It's over. And it was. Really, truly over. Not because Marcus had apologized or changed, not because the legal system had given her perfect justice, but because Catherine had decided it was over. She'd processed her trauma, done the work, built something meaningful from the ashes. She was free. 10 years after the divorce, Catherine stood in front of a packed auditorium at Boston University, her alma mater. She was 42 years old, keynote speaker at a symposium on financial literacy and domestic violence prevention. The audience was a mix of students, academics, survivors, and advocates. When I was a student here, Catherine began, I thought knowledge was power. I had a PhD, had published papers, had what I thought was a promising career. And then I met someone who made me question everything I knew about myself. Someone who convinced me that my education didn't matter, that my expertise was cute but irrelevant, that my value was in being decorative rather than substantive. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces, so many young women sitting where she'd sat, not knowing what waited for them in the world outside these walls. I'm not here to tell you not to fall in love. I'm not here to make you paranoid or cynical. I'm here to give you tools, ways to recognize manipulation before it becomes control, ways to protect yourself legally and financially, ways to trust your gut when something feels wrong. Catherine clicked to her first slide. Red flags in the first 6 months of a relationship. She went through the list methodically. Love bombing, moving too fast, isolation from friends and family, financial enmeshment, dismissing your expertise while praising your beauty, having all exes who are supposedly crazy. Here's the thing, Catherine said. Abusers don't look like monsters. They look like successful, charming people who say all the right things. Marcus Thorne looked like a catch. Smart, wealthy, attentive. Everyone thought I was lucky to be with him. I thought I was lucky. A hand went up. Catherine nodded. How do you know the difference between someone who's genuinely enthusiastic and someone who's love bombing? The student asked. Good question. Enthusiasm respects boundaries. Love bombing overwhelms them. Someone who's genuinely falling for you will be excited but patient. They'll want to know about your life, your friends, your interests. They'll encourage you to maintain your independence. Love bombing is about consumption. They want to be everything to you immediately before you have time to think clearly. More hands went up. Catherine spent the next hour answering questions, sharing stories, giving advice. This was the work she loved most. Not the high-profile cases or the media appearances, but these moments of real education, real prevention. After the talk, a line formed of people wanting to speak with her. Catherine stayed for all of them, giving each person her full attention. A woman in her 50s approached near the end. My daughter is getting married next month. Her fiancé wants her to sign a prenup. She's asking me if she should. What do I tell her? Tell her to get a lawyer, her own lawyer, not his. Tell her that any prenup worth signing should protect both parties, not just one. Tell her that if he won't pay for her to have independent legal counsel, that's a red flag. And tell her that she should never sign anything she doesn't fully understand, no matter how much she loves him. What if she really loves him? Love doesn't require legal vulnerability. Love requires trust, respect, and equality. If he loves her too, he'll want her protected as much as he wants himself protected. The woman nodded, wiping her eyes. Thank you. That evening, Catherine had dinner with the Foundation's board of directors. They met quarterly now to review finances, discuss expansion plans, and coordinate advocacy efforts. The board had grown to include some heavy hitters, a former state senator, a prominent family law attorney, a psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery, and representatives from several women's organizations. We've been invited to expand internationally, Diane reported. She was the Foundation's COO now, having left her paralegal job to work full-time on what she called the most important work of my life. Women's organizations in Canada and the UK want to partner with us. That's ambitious, Catherine said. International work means navigating different legal systems, different cultural contexts. It also means helping more women, Lisa pointed out. She was on the board but had started her own consulting firm, helping divorcing women navigate complex financial situations. The patterns of abuse don't stop at borders. Fair point. Let's start with a pilot program. Maybe partner with one organization in Toronto, see how it goes. They discussed logistics for another hour before moving on to legislative updates. The Coercive Control Act had inspired similar bills in 4 other states. The Foundation was providing testimony and expertise to help those efforts succeed. We're changing the conversation, Ruth Morrison said. She'd recently been appointed to the state Supreme Court, but still served on the Foundation's board. 5 years ago, financial abuse wasn't even in most people's vocabulary. Now we're seeing it in family court decisions, in divorce proceedings, in criminal cases. That's because of this work. It's because of survivors speaking up, Catherine corrected. We just gave them a platform. After the meeting, Catherine walked back to her car through the cold November evening. Boston was beautiful this time of year, all amber streetlights and historic brick buildings. She loved the city now in a way she hadn't been able to when she was married. It wasn't Marcus's city anymore. It was hers. Her phone rang, an unknown number but local. This is Catherine. Hi, my name is Emma. You spoke to me at a conference about 3 years ago. I was worried about a prenup. Catherine remembered. Emma, hi, how are you? I'm good, really good. I didn't marry him. The guy with the prenup, I took your advice, got a lawyer, and when I saw what was actually in the agreement, I realized you were right. It was designed to trap me. Emma's voice was stronger now, confident. I just wanted to thank you and to tell you that I'm getting married next month to someone different, someone good. We're not doing a prenup because we don't need one. We're partners. That's wonderful. Congratulations. I work in nonprofit management now, and I've been thinking the Trident Foundation could use someone with my skill set. Are you hiring? Catherine smiled. Send me your resume. This happened more often now. Women Catherine had helped, grown up and confident, and wanting to pay it forward. The foundation had become a pipeline of survivors helping survivors, each generation lifting up the next. When Catherine got home, Sarah was in the kitchen making dinner. It was their ritual. Whoever got home first cooked. The house smelled like garlic and rosemary and home. How was the talk? Sarah asked, stirring a pot of soup. Good, exhausting, but good. A lot of questions about prenups. It's engagement season. That makes sense. Sarah poured Catherine a glass of wine. You got a package, by the way, on the table. Catherine found a small box with no return address. Inside was a book. Her book, the one she'd published 2 years ago. It was worn, the pages dog-eared, highlighted throughout. And on the title page, someone had written a note. Dear Catherine, this book saved my life. I was in a marriage just like yours. I thought I was crazy. I thought I was alone. This book showed me I wasn't. I used your advice. I documented everything. I got my own lawyer. I got out. I'm free now because you were brave enough to share your story. Thank you doesn't feel like enough, but thank you. You're my hero. Sarah M. Catherine read the note 3 times, her throat tight. You okay? Sarah asked, coming up behind her. Yeah, just reminded why we do this work. Because it matters. Because it matters. They ate dinner on the couch, Justice and Justice 2, competing for lap space, watching a documentary about art forgery that Catherine had been wanting to see. It was domestic and ordinary and perfect. Later that night, as they were getting ready for bed, Sarah said, I've been thinking about something. What's that? Marriage. Catherine's heart skipped. Oh, not a proposal, not yet, but I want you to know I'm thinking about it, and I want to make sure you'd be okay with that, given everything. Catherine sat down on the edge of the bed. Marriage, the words still carried weight, still triggered something anxious in her chest. But as she looked at Sarah, kind, patient, steady Sarah who'd never once made her feel small or controlled or less than, the anxiety faded. I'd be okay with that, Catherine said. More than okay, but no prenup. Absolutely no prenup. We build together, we lose together, we trust each other. That's all I ever wanted. They got married 6 months later in a small ceremony in their backyard. Just close friends and family. Jenny was Catherine's maid of honor. Her parents cried through the whole thing. Even Maya was there, their relationship still not quite what it had been, but healing slowly. Marcus wasn't mentioned once. He had no place in this new chapter. Catherine wore a simple white dress from a boutique in Cambridge. No designer gown, no extravagance. Sarah wore a navy suit. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising partnership and respect and honesty, promising to never lose themselves in each other, to maintain their independence while building something together. I promise to love you without consuming you, Catherine said, to support you without controlling you, to be your partner in every sense of the word. I promise the same, Sarah said, and I promise that you'll always have your own bank account. The guests laughed. It wasn't a joke. At the reception, Catherine gave a short toast. 10 years ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. But I was wrong. I hadn't lost anything. I just shed a skin that never fit right in the first place. Everything I have now, this house, these friends, this work, this incredible woman I just married, none of it would exist if I hadn't fought my way free. So here's to fighting. Here's to surviving. Here's to building something new from the ashes of something terrible. And here's to all the women who are still fighting, who are still surviving, who are still building. We see you. We're with you. You're not alone. The applause was deafening. That night, as Catherine and Sarah left for their honeymoon, 2 weeks in Italy, visiting all the museums and art galleries Catherine had only ever read about, Catherine's phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number, but the message was clear. Congratulations on your wedding. I saw the photos online. You look happy. You deserve happiness. I'm glad you found it. Take care of yourself, Marcus. Catherine read it once, then deleted it without responding. She'd meant what she'd told Sarah years ago. His redemption arc didn't require her participation. She wished him well in some abstract way, but she didn't need to tell him that. She turned off her phone and took Sarah's hand as they boarded the plane to Rome. Behind her in Boston, the foundation continued its work. Women called the hotline, lawyers filed motions, advocates testified before legislatures. The ripples Catherine had started kept spreading outward, reaching women she'd never meet, changing lives she'd never know about. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. 15 years after she signed those divorce papers, Catherine stood in the same FedEx office on Boylston Street where she'd once printed an LLC transfer document for $3.47. She was printing something different now. Flyers for the foundation's 15th anniversary celebration. The young woman behind the counter looked at the flyer design and said, "Hey, you're Catherine Brown. I've seen you on the news. You're amazing." "Thank you," Catherine said, used to this now, but still slightly uncomfortable with recognition. "My mom got out of an abusive marriage because of your foundation. She calls you her guardian angel." "I'm not an angel, just someone who got tired of being a victim." "Well, you're an angel to her." The woman handed over the printed flyers. "These are on me. Consider it a thank you." Catherine tried to pay anyway, but the woman refused. So Catherine left a $50 tip instead. The anniversary celebration was held at a hotel ballroom in downtown Boston. 300 people attended: survivors, advocates, donors, board members, volunteers. The room hummed with energy, with hope, with the particular solidarity that comes from shared struggle. Catherine looked around at what they'd built. The Trident Foundation now operated in 12 states and 2 Canadian provinces. They'd helped over 2,000 women escape abusive situations. They'd gotten legislation passed in 8 states. They'd trained thousands of lawyers, therapists, and law enforcement officers on recognizing and responding to financial abuse. And Marcus Thorne was still in prison, denied parole for the second time just last year. The celebration included speeches from survivors, from legislators who'd championed their bills, from the governor who'd signed the Coercive Control Act all those years ago. But the moment that stuck with Catherine came from an unexpected source. A woman in her early 30s approached the microphone during the open testimony portion. Catherine didn't recognize her. "Hi, my name is Alicia. You don't know me, but 15 years ago, my mom was married to a man who was destroying her. He controlled everything: money, friends, where she went, what she wore. She had a PhD, but he convinced her she was stupid. She wanted to leave, but she couldn't. She'd signed a prenup that left her with nothing." Catherine felt goosebumps rise on her arms. "And then one day," Alicia continued, "she came home with a story about a woman in Boston who'd brought down a billionaire. A woman who'd documented her husband's crimes and used his own greed against him. A woman who'd smiled when she signed the divorce papers because she knew what was coming." Alicia was crying now. "That story gave my mom hope. It showed her she wasn't powerless. She started documenting her husband's financial abuse. She built a case. She got her own lawyer, and 2 years later, she was free. We were free." She looked directly at Catherine. "You saved my mom's life, which means you saved mine too. Because if she'd stayed, if she'd kept getting smaller and smaller until there was nothing left, I don't know what would have happened to her, to us, but she didn't stay. She fought back. And it started with your story." The room was silent except for the sound of people crying. "So thank you," Alicia said. "From me, from my mom, from everyone in this room and everyone who isn't in this room, but whose lives are better because you refuse to be silent. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for showing us that we could fight too." Catherine couldn't speak. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face. After the formal program ended, people mingled and shared stories. Catherine moved through the crowd, hugging survivors, thanking donors, connecting with advocates. This was her community now, her people. She found herself standing with the original group, Lisa, Sandra, Rachel, Keisha, Amanda, Diane, Ruth, Jenny, the women who'd been there from the beginning, who'd helped build this movement from nothing. We did it, Lisa said, raising her glass. We actually did it. We're not done yet, Diane corrected. There's still work to do. Always, Catherine agreed, but we can celebrate what we've accomplished so far. To the Trident Foundation, Jenny said. To survivors, Sandra added. To the women who come after us, Rachel said. May they never need us, but may we be here if they do. They drank to that. Later, Catherine stepped outside for some air. The Boston night was cool, the city lights reflecting off the harbor in the distance. She thought about the Catherine who'd walked out of that conference room 15 years ago, terrified and exhilarated and not entirely sure she'd survive what came next. She'd survived. More than survived. She'd thrived. Sarah found her on the balcony. They'd been married for 8 years now. Good years, healthy years, the kind of partnership Catherine had once thought was impossible. You okay? Sarah asked. Yeah, just thinking. About? How far we've come, how much has changed. Catherine leaned against the railing. Do you know what I don't think about anymore? Marcus. I go days, sometimes weeks without thinking about him at all. He's just irrelevant now. That's called healing. I know, it's weird. I spent so many years defined by what he did to me. And now he's just this thing that happened once. Past tense. Because you did the work. You processed the trauma. You built something meaningful from it. You didn't let it destroy you. No, I didn't. Catherine smiled. I destroyed him instead. Well, he destroyed himself. You just documented it. Semantics. They stood together watching the city. After a moment, Catherine said, I got another email from Marcus last week. Another apology? Sort of. He's being released in 5 years. He wanted me to know. Said he's planning to move to Florida when he gets out. Stay with some family down there. He said he hoped I'd found peace. Have you? Yeah, I have. Catherine turned to face Sarah. And you know what the wildest part is? I don't hate him anymore. I'm not glad he went to prison. I'm glad he was held accountable. But I don't take joy in his suffering. I'm just indifferent. He's not my villain anymore. He's just a cautionary tale. That's very evolved of you. Or very tired. I can't carry rage forever. It's too heavy. Sarah kissed her forehead. Come back inside. People want to talk to you. In a minute, Catherine stayed on the balcony a little longer, watching Boston breathe and live and move around her. This city had been the site of her greatest trauma and her greatest triumph. She'd been broken here and rebuilt here. Her phone buzzed. An email from the foundation's intake coordinator. Another woman asking for help. Another story of control and manipulation and desperate need for escape. Catherine read the email and immediately forwarded it to their legal team with instructions to call the woman first thing Monday morning. The work was never done, but that was okay. Catherine wasn't done either. She went back inside, back to her community, back to the celebration and the stories and the hope. Back to the life she'd built from nothing, from ashes, from sheer stubborn refusal to let Marcus Thorne have the last word. Across town in a storage unit she'd almost forgotten about, sat a box of documents. The original evidence files from the Marcus case. Catherine had kept one copy, locked away, just in case. She'd meant to dispose of it years ago, but had never quite gotten around to it. Next week, she decided. Next week, she'd go to that storage unit and shred everything. She didn't need it anymore. The story was written. The ending was good. And Marcus Thorne, wherever he was, had become exactly what he deserved to be. Irrelevant. 15 years after the divorce, Catherine stood in her office at the foundation headquarters, looking at the wall of photos. Hundreds of faces, women who'd come through their program, women who'd escaped, women who'd survived. Her assistant knocked on the door. Catherine, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important. Who is it? She said her name is Alicia. Said you met her at the anniversary celebration? Catherine remembered, the young woman whose mother she'd inadvertently saved. Send her in. Alicia entered, looking nervous. She was carrying a folder. Thank you for seeing me, she said. I know you're busy, but I wanted to give you this. She handed Catherine the folder. Inside were documents, legal documents, a class action lawsuit being filed against prenup mills, law firms that specialize in creating one-sided agreements designed to trap women. My mom's a lawyer now, Alicia said. She went to law school after her divorce, and this is her first major case. She's suing the law firm that created her prenup, the one that left her with nothing. She's arguing that these firms have a pattern of creating unconscionable contracts that facilitate abuse. Catherine read through the filing. It was brilliant, thorough. Exactly the kind of systemic change they'd been working toward. This is incredible, Catherine said. She wanted you to know. Said you started this. Said everything we're doing now, we're doing because you showed us it was possible. Catherine looked at Alicia, at this young woman whose life had been changed by a story, by an act of rebellion, by one woman's refusal to stay silent. Tell your mom I'm proud of her, Catherine said, and tell her if she needs any help with the case, if she needs testimony or evidence or just moral support, the foundation is here. I will, thank you. After Alicia left, Catherine sat at her desk and let herself feel it. The weight of legacy, the responsibility of having started something that had taken on a life of its own, spreading and growing and changing in ways she'd never imagined. She'd signed those divorce papers with a smile because she'd known she was winning. But she hadn't known how big that win would be. She hadn't known it would become a movement. She hadn't known it would save thousands of lives. She'd just known she was done being a victim. Everything else had followed from that one decision. Catherine picked up her phone and called Sarah. Hey, what are you doing for lunch? Nothing specific. Why? Because I love you and I want to see you, and life is short and I don't want to waste any more time on anything that isn't important. Sarah laughed. That's very philosophical of you. I'm feeling philosophical. Meet me at that Italian place in 20 minutes. I'll be there. Catherine grabbed her coat and headed for the door, but she paused at the wall of photos one more time, looking at all those faces, all those survivors, all those women who'd found the courage to leave, to fight, to rebuild. And she smiled, the same smile she'd worn 15 years ago in that conference room. The smile that said, I won. Not because she'd destroyed Marcus Thorne, though she had. Not because she'd built a successful foundation, though she had. But because she'd survived. Because she'd taken the worst thing that ever happened to her and turned it into the best thing she ever did. Because she'd signed those divorce papers with a smile and drove off not in a billionaire's car, but toward a life entirely her own. And that was worth everything. So that's Catherine's story. From signing those divorce papers with a smile to building a foundation that's helped over 2,000 women escape situations just like hers. From being told she was worthless to becoming the woman who changed laws, who created precedent, who proved that survival isn't just about getting out, it's about what you build after. Now, I want to ask you something. If this story resonated with you, if Catherine's journey made you think differently about power, about justice, about what's possible when you refuse to stay silent, do me a favor, hit that like button. Not for me, but because stories like this need to be amplified. They need to reach the woman who's sitting in her car right now, wondering if she has the strength to leave. They need to reach the young woman who's about to sign a prenup that will trap her. They need to reach everyone who thinks they're alone. Drop a comment and tell me, what moment in Catherine's story hit you the hardest? Was it when she found the hotel receipt? When her sister betrayed her? When she finally fought back? I read every single comment, and I want to know what resonated with you. And if you know someone, a friend, a sister, a coworker, who needs to hear this story, share it. Send them this video, because you might be saving a life and you don't even know it. Finally, if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're just getting started. I've got more stories like this. Stories of people who were underestimated, who were written off, who came back stronger than anyone expected. Stories that prove that your worst moment doesn't have to define you. It can transform you. Catherine Brown started with nothing but rage and a plan. She ended with a legacy. Your story might be just beginning. Stick around. Let's see where it goes. I'll see you in the next one.